Without further ado, excited to introduce our friends here. So we have Josh Williams, who's, we've seen a little bit of you over the time. Yeah, so he's a director of research at Indeed, and Nizar from Snowflake, where he leads the research team there. Hey guys, how are we doing?
Good.
Pretty good.
Awesome. Maybe we can start quickly with a little bit of your stories into research. Josh, why don't you kick things off?
Yeah, similar to Louise earlier, I started in academia, PhD in cognitive neuroscience. Had no idea what user research was. I had a background in audiology and data science, and I was going straight for data science after the PhD. And I happened to apply for a research audiologist position at Bose. And of course, when you type in researcher, user researcher came up, and I was like, sure, if those all sound like things I could do, had no idea what it was, and I applied for that. And luckily, it was the right place at the right time. Bose has a lot of PhDs. And my background in hearing, it just matched really well with what they were looking for. So that's kind of where I got my start. And since then, have worked in lots of various different places, and currently now at Indeed as the director in job seeker org. So studying how...
That might be relevant to this panel.
How folks find jobs.
That's great.
So yeah.
It's amazing.
Nizar.
Yeah, I mean, I had a pretty linear path, which seems to not be like the norm, right? So I actually did my undergrad in industrial engineering, where I knew I wanted to be in user research, did my master's in human factors, then went into consulting, the startup world, Google, and now at Snowflake, and pretty much user research across. So a very linear journey, which is not the norm. So there's no one journey that takes you to where you are.
So one of the reasons I'm really excited about this panel in particular is obviously Josh works at Indeed, which has some relevant insights here to this discussion. But also, I remember talking with you, Nizar, about when you joined Snowflake. So for those who don't know, Snowflake is a publicly traded database company. Is that correct?
It's a simplified way to say it as we make it easy for companies to put all their large data from multiple sources in one place to drive business impact.
So I remember when we were chatting, you were telling me a bit about the story joining the Snowflake team and how you were the first research person there. Where I think they were already a publicly traded company at that time. So they're already massive. They had no researchers. And perhaps there was a little bit of skepticism about the function in general. And now at this point, you have like 10 folks on your team hiring at a time where pretty much no one else is hiring. So you've kind of like bucked the trend. And so you probably have some interesting insights into how you've crafted that team over a short period of time as well. So this is going to be a really interesting discussion. Let's kick things off. This is kind of almost a bit of an unfair panel because I think there's too much to cover across a number of different roles. So here I want to talk a bit about the different paths from being an IC researcher into other roles. So you can go the route of being a manager or a lead. There's also the role of becoming a more specialized IC, like a staff researcher up to a principal. So let's kind of like unpack a little bit. Maybe, Josh, if you want to pick one of the roles that you want to poke in on, whether it's lead, manager, or staff, like what is the purpose of that role within a research team and within a company, whichever one you're excited about?
Yeah. Maybe it is my contrarian way of believing, but I actually don't think those three necessarily are different at all companies. Sometimes a lead is a manager, right? And sometimes there aren't people like directors at a company. So a manager is also a director, right? Mm-hmm. And so it is true that we have these separate tracks of management and IC, and you can equally be at higher levels for each of those, right? So you can imagine a principal is like a senior director at some places, but it's not always true. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of times when we think about, especially early managers or leads, sometimes they're doing the same thing. Mm-hmm. They have a smaller team. They might be still doing some level of research as well, but their whole goal is to kind of democratize through their team and deliver impact through the folks that report to them. Where you really start to see more specialization in that manager track is where you start to maybe take on more strategy conversations, where you start to understand the business really deeply and know how to deploy your team to get the business impact that you want, where you might not, with a lead or a very specialized IC role, you might be focused on a very particular part of the business. And so as you get higher in the management track, you're really trying to expand your scope and influence strategy and influence product at a much larger scale.
When you talk about strategy, can you kind of like give an example of like what that means? Like I feel like there's, for example, a lot of folks who do like undergrad MBA and then want to be a strategy person or something like that. And it's like, what does that mean, strategy, versus, when you actually like learn a core skill, you become specialized in it, and now you've got to be involved in strategy. Like, what does that specifically mean in the context of a bigger team?
Right. Yeah. The way I see it is when you're trying to influence strategy, it can mean lots of different things. It can mean, are we going to invest our time in a particular product space or our product offering? And should we be thinking about something else entirely? It could also mean, at almost a business strategy point of view, do we dedicate resources to a particular, again, experience or product offering in that way? And so as you become bigger and bigger in terms of delivering impact to the strategy, you're really trying to decide, how is the business going to operate? And when you think about at a smaller level of, should we have a researcher do a usability study for this or that, that's not the level of strategy that we're talking about, but rather, should we even de-risk something and deliver research there or not?
Cool. That's great context. Nizar, when you think about the differences between these roles and, because you've recently constructed a team out, right? How did you come to the decision of this role is going to be a staff person, this role is going to be a lead or a manager, and what is kind of like the job to be done, the mandate that they're out there trying to fulfill for you and for your team and for the broader company?
So there are multiple questions here to unpack. The first one is that the title doesn't always mean the same thing in different places, right? So a senior could be a staff, could be a principal, could be a whatever, and different companies could define them differently. So a lot of the time it's less about like the exact definition of the title and more about what does that role entail, what does the scope entail. To be honest, how much does the role pay as well? So all of that kind of like ends up overlapping as well. So a lot of the times, I think there were some great comments in the earlier panel about like speak to your recruiter, learn more about like what the actual definition could mean, rather than like anchor on the specific word, for example. But to kind of zoom out and answer the question, especially at the more senior levels, it stops being about can you do the research, and it stops being an interview process of did you pass or did you fail. It becomes a matter of, is this person going to have the skill set and what they can offer is going to be compatible with the problems that we're trying to solve here. So it becomes, to some extent, more of a one-to-one matching that start reflecting a lot of the times the problems that are being faced for that specific role. So you'll see a lot more kind of like hypotheticals, a lot more specifics that look into the variables that hiring manager might be looking for that specific role.
Can you give like an example? I think people conceptually have like a pretty good understanding of like a manager because we've had them, right? And you can kind of, through osmosis, get a sense of like what work is like and what their life is like. But for like an example where you want to invest in a senior IC role, like a staff role, that particular role, how do you come to the decision where it's like, we need to hire a staff person, or is it more like, we need somebody to come and help this and they need to be really specialized, and so we should kind of frame it in this way? Like, how does that evolve on like your team, for example, if you were to make that call?
For sure. And one thing that's, I think, different now compared to like 10 years ago is that it used to be that the progression upwards is to become a manager eventually. And that's kind of changing for the most part. Like, you could have a path forward in your career as an IC and then become, again, depends on the place, a staff, a principal, a senior principal researcher. And that's a great career path if that's where you're going. So for us, it actually starts with the definition of the open scope. We're really looking at what's the business need that we have, what's the reason we're hiring a researcher in the first place, and then what does that researcher need to have? A lot of the times, that starts defining where are we looking at it. Is it a lot more to do with stakeholder management, really ambiguous spaces, there's no research whatsoever? Or is it something where we actually have a research program that's been established and we need somebody to help out, let's say with like the velocity of some of the tactical implementation? And a lot of the times that definition each company to some extent has some sort of a ladder, and you
Right.
kind of like map it to where are we looking at what level and where are we slotting that researcher. Once the interview process happens, a lot of times there is some flexibility depending on the performance of the researcher who's applying, the skill set that they have, and then you can re-gauge. But for the most part, that stuff is defined before you start hiring based on just the business need.
Got it. So broadly speaking, would it be fair to say these roles, while they have different titles, there's quite a bit of overlap in the types of work and responsibilities generally, other than one tends to be a little bit more management focused, and then you have other ones that are just like, you're just going to be focused on the IC work. Would that kind of be fair to say?
Yeah, I think so to a large degree. I think we've both touched on the fact that it's really around scope often, right? And as your scope increases, typically do you need those higher IC level roles?
Let's hone in on that word scope there for a sec. Can you give an example of like what you would expect as a differentiated level of scope between, let's say, a senior UX researcher versus a lead or a staff level on a project? Come up with some kind of hypothetical example that kind of illustrates what the gulf is between those two?
Yeah, definitely. So I can give some really concrete examples, like at Indeed. The Indeed business is split up into two businesses. We have the employer side and we have the job seeker side. And then within that, we have the different product spaces. And when we think about what a senior IC might do, they might own the research or the area of one single product space. That could mean still more than one PM. It could still mean more than one designer as their partners. But typically it's that one product space. When we think about lead and as we go towards kind of principal, we start to think about either end-to-end for all of job seeker. So you start to understand end-to-end flows and experiences of the job seeker, and you're helping connect the dots across all of these different product spaces. Or as you go even higher, across GMs. So how are we thinking about the employer and the job seeker experiences together? And how are we influencing how the employer team is going to tackle a particular problem, maybe like applicant quality, and job seeker is going to tackle applicant quality. And we need to bring those together. And that's typically going to be where we expect higher level IC and also have impact on how other researchers. Mm-hmm. So, two senior researchers might collaborate, but with a lead researcher or a principal, we're expecting them to impact entire research teams, maybe, and kind of delegate an action through them as well.
So there's like, to be a little bit crude with it, it's like for some of that higher level work, it's almost like more intense generative core understanding of how the world is working and how the product is working to the entire business almost. And you have a tremendous amount of expertise in research to be able to craft a plan to answer a very big, painful, ambiguous question that's important to lots of people and to navigate the complexity around it.
Yes, yeah, because the way we really conceptualize it is if you're going to be a lead, you're also equivalent to a director, for instance. So when you think about a director's scope and the amounts of research teams that report to them, you would imagine something very similar for a lead, but maybe not quite as in the same way or organizationally defined, but that level of scope or influence is also going to be pretty equivalent.
That's interesting. Do you have any examples that kind of come to mind as to how you might break that down?
We actually have a very different perspective, maybe at Snowflake and how we operate with that. And again, that speaks to how different companies and different hiring managers are different.
If there's any takeaways for anybody here, it's that it all depends, and
there's no one
every space is different.
Sure. But for us, it really starts with what exists today. Every hiring manager is motivated to have a researcher who will succeed in their job, right? But then how do you find success? And a lot of the times, you don't want your most senior researchers to say, hey, tactical stuff is none of my business. A lot of times, the biggest impact that you can have is through incremental improvement. So you want to find the researcher who actually has the ability to understand the wide variables and when to zoom out and when to zoom in. When do I move the business quickly? And when do I have them slow down? And that understanding of the variables becomes a good definition of their seniority compared to kind of like putting them in a bucket of, hey, now you're senior, you only do strategic. You're junior, you only do tactical. And we've had a lot of really senior, very established researchers unblock major disagreement on something that's very tactical that end up having like millions of dollars of impact, but the researcher needs to get involved. So there's that level of I like to look at, in general, each researcher and their skill set as a platform in a way. Like you're kind of starting to understand what the different variables are and how can you tackle those different variables as they come your way. And the more variables that you're able to tackle, that tends to correlate with your seniority along the path.
I feel like this is a really good opportunity to transition into what are the attributes of successful folks in these roles, because one of the things that's coming out loud and clear here, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is the ability to coordinate across lots of different people, individuals, stakeholders, and another thing seems to be just like business wisdom and instincts as to like how these things function, which to me is really interesting because when you think about, I think most people in their mental models for how you get ahead as a researcher, it doesn't involve understanding like P&L spreadsheets, and it definitely doesn't involve improved project management skills necessarily. So what are some of the key things, like when you're hiring for these roles or when you're thinking about what are the attributes that make for a successful person in these roles? What are some of those buckets that are like super important?
Yeah, I really lean in on the business sense a lot of times, or the product sense when looking at higher level roles. At the end of the day, I think even to your point, it's a lot about how do we unlock, how do we influence, and we tend to see that higher, more senior ICs have that ability to kind of galvanize, bring folks together, and unlock some issues. And so really, to me, it's more about, do you understand the business? Do you understand why we're doing what we're doing? Do you understand the end-to-end? Do you have a holistic, big picture way of thinking about things so that you can know when to zoom in, know when to zoom out, and how to gather the forces in order to get us to act in whatever way you need? And so sometimes it's a lot more of those intangible kind of interview questions of like, tell me about a time when the business was not doing so well and you helped, define a clearer path, or how have you identified risk related to X, Y, and Z? How have you brought disparate teams together? Those types of things are really important, way more than, methods or whatnot. There are occasions where we might want to hire a principal quant person, right? And maybe we don't typically have quant in our skill set, and so we want to highlight that through a higher level IC role. But for the most part, we're really focused on people that can influence at the end of the day.
Got it.
And it's kind of interesting too, because attributes is an interesting word, right?
Yeah.
Like at the end of the day, you don't want the interview feedback to come in as they were too introverted, they were too extroverted, they were too action-oriented, they were too... At the end of the day, like if we can zoom out of the specific attribute and look at like what is their ability to tackle multiple different types of problems, and how does that grow and how does that overlap, I think that becomes a pretty neat framework to look through. So to kind of like look at it from the perspective like what you look for specifically, especially at the more senior level, the research rigor, the ability to research just becomes table stakes. There's, in the interview process, we actually don't spend too much time talking about it. We do our check. I would give it about like a 20% of our interview process looks at like your ability to conduct research and how your approach makes sense or not. The rest of it really starts falling into your ability to have impact, your ability to work cross-functionally across different settings, your ability to tie your work to very, very specific outcomes and what actually happens and how that impacts the business. So it starts really falling a lot into why should the company hire you rather than just like why should the research team hire you? And it expands out of your research.
How do you identify those areas, for example, where you're mentioning these like areas of impact, right? And so there's clearly a judgment element to a lot of this stuff, where you develop a sense of we need to accomplish this outcome, move this number. How do you identify what those areas are? And then is there an expectation that research should help kind of like galvanize the effort to do something, or is this something that should already be in motion from your point of view?
It depends on the scope. It depends on like who you're hiring and why you're hiring them. But for the most part, the idea of you preparing for your next job actually doesn't start at the interview process. I mentor a lot of people who come in and say like, I think I messed up the interview, and then you dig in and the disconnect might have been like in how their current role is defined. So I always tell people like your preparation for your next job is now. It's whatever you're doing now. And the same applies as you're looking to get promoted. People want to see you perform at the next level or the next scope to be able to comfortably say, hey, we can have you there. The same applies for a new job. If you're looking at the ability to kind of drive something that's more strategic, if you're looking for something in the B2B world, then you're targeting these specific openings that are looking for this, but you're working on your story in that regard specifically. But there are some stories where you see somebody with 10 years of experience and they've done a great job doing a rapid research program, but they've been doing it for 10 years, right? So you can say like, yeah, I have 10 years, I need to be like a senior. And the question becomes, did you set yourself up for like what you want to be doing next?
Right.
And again, in this sense, it's not that there's one that's good, one that's bad. It's that you have that trajectory of what are you looking for next and how does it align with the skill sets that you've built, communicate it through the resume, then communicate it through the interview process.
Can we define like a little bit business sense? Like when you think about that, is there any, how can we bring some tangibility to that framing, right? It almost kind of feels to some extent this idea of like, healthiness, for example. It's like a vague term. We have a sense of kind of what it means, but then we can also break that down into like, well, can you run 5 miles? Can you lift heavy objects? Is your diet good? And you can kind of get specific there. Are there examples of kind of like breaking down this idea of business sense into component pieces to help bring some tangibility to it? Josh, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, when it comes to business sense, in many ways, it's about understanding the trade-offs between the business needs and the user needs, and why, as a company, are we doing what we're doing, right? At the end of the day, business sense is if we are trying to drive revenue or try to drive engagement or whatever kinds of business metrics we're thinking about, are you aware of those? One, do you understand what their implications are? And do you understand the levers for which we can pull in order to do that, while situating that in the end user needs and knowing when to push on what is a better user experience, and we might take a hit from a business point of view or vice versa. And knowing that and what those levers are is really what I think of when I think of business sense, because ultimately, we can't divorce the user experience from our business outcomes. They are in many ways one and the same, but there are going to be times where we add more friction or we do things that we would say hurt the user, but it's ultimately going to drive revenue or reduce churn or something along those lines.
So those things right there, I think, are good to hone in on. There's some really great frameworks, I think, in the product space that have been well established around, like what a conversion funnel is, right? And how conversion funnels are useful tools to understand, where there are opportunities to increase revenue. So what rate are people visiting your website to signing up versus doing a trial versus paying versus sticking around for a long time, right? And you can measure those. And, as a researcher, you can look at your website and see like, man, this looks a little confusing. And maybe that's why our conversion rate from visiting our website to signing up is so low. Let's do research around that, right? So I always found like a lot of the product management frameworks helpful places to start if you're looking to build a little bit of that business sense, because there's a lot of times the accountability is there where they'll be explicit. They'll say, we got to get our churn below 3% this quarter, right? And so that can kind of be the mandate too sometimes. I don't know if you have anything you want to add on to that as well.
Yeah, to take it back to the initial question on kind of business sense, typically it actually shines throughout the process. You can kind of see it with the applicant. It actually does start in the resume phase, right? So I know there were some comments on like, don't focus too much on your resume, and I agree to some sense, but make sure that your resume stands out of the 300, 400 that will be presented. And one thing I tell people over and over is most resumes will come in as conducted qualitative and quantitative research, ran a research program. Like, we know that's a given. So right. Are you able to kind of inject why these activities that you've conducted have led to something that's meaningful? A lot of times these are the people that you can tell are already kind of anchored on their business impact and their business sense, and that's where you can get that signal. The same then applies as they move through into the interview process. So we do see it very frequently where researchers anchor so heavily on their research, and that's the start of the show. The reveal is the report, and then I'm done, mic drop. But there's more to that. There's more to like the context of it. Why did you do that? Why did it happen in the first place? What was your role in lining everybody up around it? And then after you did it, what happened? How did the business move forward? So a lot of this stuff, it's not necessarily that, hey, there's multiple ways to do it. it's just about the intentionality of each research applicant and telling that story that zooms out of just the research activity into the impact that happened after.
Yeah, and kind of off that, when I think of a pretty senior IC, it's also the case that they're often collaborating with product science or data science or other kinds of functions to understand and triangulate, right? We talk about you don't have to be a mixed methods researcher to be a principal researcher, but what you do have to know is how can I find that data somewhere else? And so when you're trying to think about impact, that impact might not be immediately, evident in your research, but rather a more senior researcher is going to know how to find that or to triangulate multiple sources of data, or they're going to have such a relationship with their product partners that they understand these kinds of connections as well. And so I wanted to touch on like impact and in business sense is also just knowing who to partner with at the organization and how to drive those outcomes together.
That's great. I want us to talk briefly about the hiring process and who's involved and how that differs at some of the earlier levels. We're getting a ton of great questions coming in. I want to ask one real quick here, which is, Nizar, you already mentioned the running the rapid research program for 10 years example. And someone's asking for someone who wants to do more strategic research and who's been doing that for 10 years.
Yeah.
How do they present themselves in a way to hopefully get that role, or are they not really in a position to be able to do that at all at that point?
My honest take to everybody is try. You have nothing to lose. Apply to the job that you want.
Yeah.
There's nothing to lose. There's a little bit of like, hey, don't apply to this. Let the recruiter deal with it. Let the hiring manager deal with it. You might not get the job, but just go for it anyway. But what you can do in the meantime is how do you gradually change the role that exists today, what you're doing today, into what you want to shape out.
Can we talk about that kind of change? Because I feel like sometimes we expect these changes to happen like in these stepwise functions where it's like, my job's kind of crappy right now. Oh, great. Like I asked so-and-so to make it better and boom, it's like 50% better. But it feels like, I think in reality, it's way more like a line function than a step function. How do you over time like inch your way to addressing that and changing it?
You tell the story of if I do this thing differently, I actually bring more value to the business and the team. So you bring it back to the reason why you're doing that.
Mm-hmm.
If you're coming at it from the perspective of, you know what, I don't like what I'm doing. I'm just going to do something else right now. What's the story? Why are you doing that? A lot of the times you're able to actually, people have more control over their scope than they think.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times it's to think that, hey, like this is the job you've been hired for. This is the job they thought they wanted to hire you for. But it's actually up to you, and you're able to, in a lot of times, and again, to be transparent, not all environments are perfect. But you're able to have more impact and influence on your trajectory than you may think.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of the times, find that business problem that you're like, you know what? I think I can make you a few $1 million if I just do this thing.
Mm-hmm.
It may work, it may not, but make the business case for why you need to do things differently, and then align that with where your interests are. And it's much easier to make that transition if your needs from a growth perspective are aligned with the business needs from a business growth perspective.
Right. Mm-hmm. So instead of, hey, I want to change my thing, it's, I want to achieve your goals for you in a better way.
I have identified an opportunity where I think I can drive value if I use 20% of my time to do this, and go for it.
Cool. All right, we're going to get to a bunch of questions. So if you have questions here, line those up. But before we do, two things I want to cover quickly. One is how does the actual process of hiring change from a intermediate or senior IC role to one of these staff, lead, manager roles in terms of who's involved, in terms of how long it is, in terms of how you evaluate the talent? What are some of the big differences there from your experiences?
Yeah, this definitely differs if it's a manager track or those higher IC roles. For management, often don't care as much about a portfolio per se, but rather how to coach and what is your impact through others, those types of things. And as such, typically you're going to interview with more other management, but also you're going to probably, unless you're building a team from scratch, going to interview with the team you're going to manage, right? And that is going to be a really important piece of the puzzle. And even folks you're not going to manage, because there's always a reorg, You might manage someone else at some point. So we're really going to index on that relationship building, but also understand from a management perspective, how do you overcome certain conflict or low performance or whatever those cases may be. Whereas for a more senior IC, typically what I have seen in the past is you're going to engage more with other director level folks or a larger part of the business. We might throw in someone from corp dev or someone from a higher strategy conversation to interview you than just your normal product and design partners more immediately. And so to me, the product or the process doesn't necessarily change. It's the folks that you're talking to and the types of things, as we've touched on, that we're teasing apart that changes.
Yeah, the focus areas are slightly different, but I will say, like, the process is still very different depending on the company that you are interviewing at. If I remember correctly, at my time at Google, you're interviewing 5 researchers, regardless at like many levels, until you become like way on the executive senior level. At Snowflake, you interview 1 researcher, 1 product manager, 1 designer, 1 engineer, almost no matter what your level is. So there's a lot of variability there, and there's no like one size fits all. I think when you're looking at like more senior ICs versus managers, there's a shared baseline. I think the shared baseline does kind of speak to your ability to do/understand the research approaches, your ability to connect it to business, your ability to understand the constraints. Those tend to be like more on the universal end. It's very easy to come and say, you need to build this thing that will take you 3 years to build from an engineering perspective. It's much harder to understand how to break that down to something that the engineering team can actually build. So there's that baseline. But then as you kind of go later into the interview process, you're really looking at, from a managerial perspective, there's a lot of components on, honestly, not only managing down. I think there's a lot of focus on the managing down because that's the apparent part, but the managing sideways, managing up, and managing into the rest of the org. Versus when you're looking at a really senior IC, you're maybe actually doubling more down into the breadth of the toolkit that they have. I do agree with what was said earlier on, like, you don't need to say I do quantitative and I do qualitative, but at the same time, are you able to deal with many different types of problems that could arise? And there's more of a deep dive there. So you may get a lot more hypotheticals over, here's a situation that you were in, what would you do? There's no right answer, but it showcases your ability to kind of look at the different scenarios and how you can tackle them.
That's really quickly, one other thing too is we might, I think we talked about this earlier this morning, we might come in, I'm a hiring manager, I want to hire another manager. I have too many direct reports, I need to, duplicate myself. And I interview someone and I'm like, man, they would be a shit manager, but they are amazing at business sense or influence or strategy. And I might just change that role and hire that person anyway because I need them. Maybe I can go a little bit longer, managing some folks, maybe put some folks under them to mentor and take some of the load off, can still do the HR related, people management stuff. But these things can change. And depending on where you're at, you might apply for a manager role and end up as a more senior IC, vice versa. I don't want to overstate that everyone's going to be a good manager if you're a high, there are different skill sets there, but it is possible that those things shift.
Yeah, totally. Do we have any questions here? Yeah, Megan, go for a quick question.
So this may be going to be a hot take or maybe not, I'm not sure, but from my experience, the best hiring experience has been when the hiring manager themselves are reviewing the applications and they really know what's needed and the qualities that maybe aren't on the surface, but are like underlying and they can fill that role really well. What are your perspectives around being more hands-on in the recruitment process and reviewing applications more so yourself, rather than it being so heavily on the recruiters when perhaps they're not as senior of a recruiter in that particular specialization and may not be able to see the things that you'd be able to see.
So question, just to repeat it, is around how do you think about you as a hiring manager being super hands-on, taking the whole process off versus outsourcing some of that work to a recruiter and trade-offs around that, and how do you feel about it in general?
Yeah. It's never a this or that. You're never like very hands-on or the recruiter is very hands-on. Personally, I'm a lot more on the hands-on side. on a regular opening, we get like 400 resumes. I actually personally look at 200 of them. But at the same time, relying on the recruiter to be able to highlight kind of some of the talent that will overlap with what we're looking for as well. So personally, I see it as a partnership throughout. We have a dedicated recruiter who knows exactly what we're looking for and the differences between the positions as well. But it's actually hard to kind of gauge like, hey, this is the right way to do it and this is not. There's always a calculation of how much of my time should fall there versus some of the other things that I need to do. There's a calculation of to what extent is the recruiter comfortable versus not. So I think it's very context specific as like, would this result in better than none? To be honest, some hiring managers don't always know what they're looking for. So there is that gap where the assumption is saying they'll know more than the recruiter. Not necessarily.
Yeah, I 100% agree. I have a million things to do, and it's all about the ROI of my time. And I, particularly depending on the role, depending on the recruiter's skill set, it might be worth my time to be really in the weeds. I have in the past looked at all 400 of the resumes. It depends on the ATS that you have and other kinds of extractions that it can do. So you can maybe automatically pare down some things, but for the most part, I will look at all of them, even if it's 3 seconds each, and I look real quick, nope, and look real quick, nope. And it is a better use of your time sometimes, but as a hiring manager, sometimes it's not, and you need to outsource that and know when it is best for the business, best for your team to rely on your skilled partners that you have.
Yeah, it's a great question here from Jen. I think this is a really interesting one. Someone who has been on a UX research team of one, so basically de facto leading the function, but it's just them. They want to join a bigger / more mature team. How do they think about where they fit across the roles that we've been discussing and positioning themselves for them?
It's so hard to answer that question without seeing their resume, where they are, what they've done, where they're applying. It's almost impossible to answer it. But I think what stays consistent is what are they looking for? Where are they in their career?
Right.
What are their objectives? And how do they line that up with some of the roles where they might see that there's a value add for both them and the hiring manager?
So it's really where they want to be and where they think they can see themselves being successful, and it's probably more a judgment on their end from your point of view.
It's just really hard with all the unknowns to answer that very clearly. Right?
Yeah, for sure. Jen, send us an email and we'll do an evaluation in an email thread of your situation.
Jen, send me your resume and I'll follow up with you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's 100% accurate. I think, research isn't created equal at all places, and it is very possible there's also some correlation. If you're a researcher of one, you might be at a startup versus, most of the time very large corporations aren't going to have a researcher of one. And so there's a lot of other kinds of, covariates to it, right? Like you lack process or all these other things that you don't know what it's like at a bigger corporation. So it's really hard without one knowing the applicant, but them knowing that other company or that role to know how to shift yourself. At the end of the day, if you know who you are, you can tell your story that matches whatever organization you're applying to.
So I think that there's another question here from Susan that I think is a particularly interesting one, and hopefully because of the roles that you have, you might have some good context on this here. But I think a lot of researchers, you get to a certain point and then you feel like you're capped out on growth. For research ops people, that might be a few levels of abstraction lower. So if you're a reops manager, maybe it's like trying to get ahead and take another step up, whatever that means to them. Like, are there skills or opportunities for growth that seem like a good transition for them? Both things to learn about, but also a next role or a next step for them to get a little further with career growth for them.
Well, yeah, I think it depends if they're wanting to stay in a manager track, for instance. I think it's the easiest to shift across disciplines, right? I would venture to say that research managers could be design managers, could be reops managers. There are, of course, nuances and things like that. And so if you're trying to, in this case, level up from a res ops manager to like a director, the difference between a manager and director is highly dependent on the business and budget and organizational structure and all of those types of things. So that might be much harder. But if looking to level up and become a research manager or lead a function somewhere else, I actually don't think there's much that you have to level up on. It's telling that story slightly differently.
Right. Anything to add there?
Again, depends on the context of the person, but in research ops specifically, like there's always an opportunity to also evolve beyond your influence on the research team, specifically on the operations, and a lot more into the holistic business processes. So what's your role in making sure that research is represented in product processes, design processes, and seeing how that kind of fits in. But again, in the absence of their background, it's very hard to.
For sure. We're going to take one more in-person question, one more remote here. How do you teach, mentor, or coach business sense for the researchers on your teams? I think even whether it's at a senior UXR level, what are some of the opportunities where you try as you're managing them to like what are the tactics there that kind of come out for either one of you?
Yeah, we're very intentional about business outcomes as a research team as a whole. So we actually do start our planning process with what's the potential business impact, and then zoom out into what are the research questions, and then zoom out.
Can you describe like what that business impact statement or factoid might look like?
Yeah, it actually could mean a lot more than people think. We have an internal sheet that has a drop down that has, I think, 50 words that describe impact, and I think launch is the easiest one. But launch, deprioritized, whether you change something internal from a process perspective, whether there's such a broad definition to impact.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the times people get anchored in too heavily on the exact metrics and the exact launch. There's a lot more to it. I think what researchers deserve to get a lot more credit for is when something doesn't launch, when something shifts gear into something different, when engineering resources have been prioritized somewhere else. In our case, there are some instances where a researcher's work has actually fed directly into a potential customer becoming a customer. So it's not even to do with the product. So there's, I think, a very long list that could be very company specific. But at the end of the day, like really starting the conversation with when you're spending your time, can we try to be as concrete as possible on what will happen at the business level, and then work backwards to the questions. And we try to intentionally do that so we're avoiding a situation where the relationship with product becomes, I have questions, can you answer them for me?
Mm-hmm.
Or can you run a survey for me? Or can you do an NPS survey for me? You get a lot of these requests that as you zoom out, it just becomes much easier for the researchers to become part of that conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think quickly we try to structure this business sense in lots of different levels. So in the rubric, in your evaluation, we actually define business sense, or what we call influence, as a key factor of what it means to be a good researcher. You're evaluated against it.
How do you evaluate that? Like literally on the rubric, what do you put on there, and how do you decide what you put on there? I think that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think a really good example of this is, we all have OKRs, right? And product is really honed in on those OKRs, whether it's, increase adoption by 20% year over year or whatever, right? And research, we then evaluate, how did you work with your partner, your product partner, to define any of the user needs, the risks, whatnot, and tie your research to that OKR.
Mm-hmm.
Now, not always does all research need to be tied to an OKR. And a lot of times research is so ahead of things, we measure delayed impact multiple quarters later and say, oh, well, you helped this KR multiple quarters later. But at the end of the day, we will ask, particularly when product has a certain goal, how did you help your product partner achieve that goal? What was the influence of your research? Whether it was deprioritize, or whether it was help create some nuance that's going to unlock them to get to where they're at. Because a lot of times product will say, I don't know how to increase 20% adoption. How do we do that? And that's where research can help. Right. And so that knowing that is important for research to do in terms of both road mapping as well as understanding how to influence.
That's great. We're going to take one final question, this time from the audience, a quick one. Does anybody have one? Yeah, right there.
I guess one thing I didn't hear you all talk about is
senior designer goes and hit the pedal a little bit, or even release the pedal and going on, hit the pedal, break up to slow down. In my experiences before, it's been like, all right, we got to speed up, try to get this research in. And then like the best senior designers that I worked with, or UX researchers, were the ones who were like, well, maybe let's hold off, let's make sure that everyone kind of can yield. How much does that play a role into the actual, I guess, selection of the candidate?
So just to repeat the question, when you're thinking about picking a candidate for one of these types of roles, how does their ability to impact velocity of shipping, either to make it faster or to even in some cases slow it down, how does that factor in? Does it factor into your decision-making process?
There's two ways to understand your question. If you're asking about the velocity of the research itself, it's less of a direct factor. It's not like we go to the person, we're like, can you do the thing in half the time? It just depends on their ability to kind of gauge the scope. The second part is how do they increase the velocity of the product and kind of the development process. And that does become key, but linked directly to their ability to influence. I was mentioning earlier pretty much the variables across. Do you understand where you are in the process and where you can have impact that could help the team? Pretty much de-risk is what you're doing. You're trying to get to a final. Nothing's final. Everything's iterative, but a final outcome more efficiently, and that is a form of impact that we speak about as well.
Yeah, and I think another way, at least the way I interpret it too, is for more senior folks, I expect them to throw out their misconceptions of how orgs work or whatever to say, why are we moving at this speed? Do you really need this? And that's where I see the differentiation happen. Not whether they can move faster or not, but rather, do they know when to, why they're doing what they're doing, and be willing to change the course of whatever is happening and feel confident in that and not be bogged down with what I see typically more junior researchers do is, I have to conduct this research in a sprint, I have to do this, this, and this, and then I'll deliver that, then move on, and then this, and this, and this. More senior folks are like, wait, why are we doing it this way? What should we be doing differently? What should we continue to be doing? And that's, I think, a really good hallmark of that.
I love that.